The dust hadn't even settled from their peculiar entrance when every seasoned card player in Copper Creek knew their comfortable days of easy money were about to end. Chang and Eng Nakamura didn't just walk into the Silver Dollar Saloon that fateful Tuesday evening. They glided in with an otherworldly grace that made the piano player's fingers stumble over the... Connected at the hip since birth, the twins moved as one fluid entity, their synchronized steps creating an almost hypnotic rhythm across the worn wooden floor. But it wasn't their physical condition that sent a chill down every spine in that harmonious giggling that seemed to know seats no one else. The Silver Dollar had seen its share of peculiar character. Copper Creek sat at the crossroads of three major cattle trails, making it a natural gathering place for drifters, cowboys, and fortune seekers of every stripe. The saloon's regulars had grown accustomed to the unusual, but nothing had prepared them for the Nakamura twins. At first glance, they appeared to be in their early 30s, with jet black hair slicked back and identical handlebar mustaches that curved upward in permanent smile. They wore matching black suits that had been expertly tailored to accommodate their unique physiology, and each carried a leather sack that clinked softly with what sounded like coin. "Evening, gentlemen," Chang said, his voice carrying a slight accent suggested distant travels. "We understand this establishment hosts some of the finest card games west of the Mississippi." Eng's giggle accompanied his brother's words like a musical counterpoint. "We've come such a very long way to test our skills against the legendary players of Copper Creek." At the largest poker table, 5 men looked up from their cards with expressions ranging from curiosity to thinly veiled hostility. These weren't ordinary, they were professional gamblers, men who had made their living separating honest hard-earned. Blackjack Morrison, the most notorious of the group, had supposedly won 3 ranches and 2 general stores in the past month alone. His cold blue eyes assessed the newcomers, the calculating stare of a predator, sizing up potential prey. "Well, well," Morrison, setting down his cards with deliberate slowness, "ain't you two a sight? Tell me, boys, which one of you does the thinking, and which one just goes along for the ride?" The twins' synchronized laughter filled the room like wind chimes in a gentle... Other patrons found themselves drawn, forming a loose circle around the poker table as an electric tension began to build. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete, who had been serving drinks in Copper Creek for 15 years, later claimed he felt the very air change when those twins started laughing together. "Oh, Mr. Morrison," Chang replied, his dark eyes twinkling with hidden... "You assume we think separately. How delightfully naive." "We are of one mind," Eng added, their giggles intertwining once again. "One consciousness flowing through 2 bodies. It makes certain activities advantageous." Morrison's weathered face darkened. He had built his reputation on reading people, on understanding their tells and exploiting their weaknesses. But these two unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Still, his pride wouldn't allow him to back down from what sounded like a challenge. "Advantageous, you say? Well then, why don't you boys pull up a chair? Chairs, and we'll see just how advantageous your situation really is." The twins moved to the table with that same eerie coordination, Chang sliding onto a chair, while Eng positioned himself on a specially arranged stool that accommodated their connection. From their matching satchels, they produced identical rolls of silver dollars that began stacking with mathematical precision. "We prefer 5-card stud," Chang announced. "Simple rules, pure strategy, and excellent opportunities," Eng giggled, "for those who can truly see." The first hand began innocuous. Morrison dealt the cards with fluid expertise of decades, his fingers dancing across the deck in practiced motion. The twins received their cards in perfect synchronization, each brother holding his hand at the exact same angle. But something peculiar happened when they looked at their cards. Instead of the typical poker face every professional cultivated, they began that soft, musical giggling again. "Interesting," Chang murmured, arranging his cards with deliberate care. "Very interesting indeed," Eng echoed, his identical movements creating an almost mirror-like effect. Morrison held a pair of kings, a strong opening hand that should have given him confidence. But watching the twins' synchronized reaction, he felt his first twinge of uncertainty. Their giggling seemed to intensify whenever they looked cards, as if they were sharing some private joke that only they understood. The betting began conservatively, each player testing the waters. But as the rounds progressed, an unsettling pattern emerged. Whenever the twins giggled, really giggled with that harmonious sound that made everyone else's skin crawl, they inevitably won the hand. It wasn't immediate. Sometimes they would fold early, only to reveal later that they had been holding unbeatable cards. Other times they would stay in against impossible odds and somehow pull victory from the jaws of defeat. "How exactly," demanded Slick Willie Patterson, another regular at the table, "do you two decide who bets and who folds? Seems like quite the coordination problem." The twins exchanged a look that seemed to contain entire conversations. "We don't decide separately," Chung explained patiently. "When you share a consciousness, decisions become shared, like two hands controlled by the same mind," Aang added with another giggle. "We see what the other sees, know what the other knows." A cold realization began to dawn on Morrison. In poker, information was everything. The ability to read opponents, to catch tell, to notice pattern. These skills separated professionals from amateurs. But what if you literally had two sets of eyes, two perspectives on every player, every hand, every gesture? What if you could observe from multiple angles simultaneously while appearing to be focused on your own card? The pile of silver in front of the twins continued to grow. Not dramatically, they were far too clever for that, but steadily, inexorably. They seemed to know exactly when to bluff and when to fold, when to press an advantage and when to retreat. More disturbing still, their giggling appeared to be some sort of communication. Different rhythms, different pitches, all seemingly meaningless to everyone else, clearly conveying complex information. The brothers. "I've had enough of this," growled Deadeye Danny Sullivan, the third member of Morrison's usual. Sullivan had earned his nickname not from shooting prowess, but from his ability to spot marked cards and loaded dice from across a crowded room. "Ain't natural, the way you two operate. How do we know you ain't somehow signaling each other about our cards?" The twins' laughter took on a different quality, still musical, but with an edge that made the hair on the back of everyone's necks stand up. "Signal each other?" Chang repeated, genuine amusement in his voice. "My dear Mr. Sullivan," Eng continued seamlessly, "we don't signal each other. We are each other. When Chang sees your nervous twitch when you're bluffing, I see it too. When I notice how Patterson arranges his chips differently with strong hands, Chang knows it as well." "Two minds," Chang said. "One consciousness," Aang finished, "seeing everything." The revelation sent a chill through every professional gambler in the room. They had built their careers on observation, on reading people, on gathering information their opponents didn't know they were revealing. But against an opponent who could literally observe from two positions simultaneously, who could process twice as much visual information while maintaining perfect coordination, what defense did they have? Morrison tried to rally his composure. "Well then, boys, sounds like you've got yourselves quite the advantage. But poker ain't just about seeing. It's about thinking, about strategy. And I've been thinking about cards longer than you've been breathing." The twins' response was another cascade of synchronized giggle. "Oh, Mr. Morrison," Chang said with what sounded like genuine fondness, "you still don't understand. We don't think faster than you. We think differently. When you process information, it goes through one mind, one set of experiences, but our thoughts—" Chang paused, looking directly into Morrison. "Our thoughts flow between us like water between connected vessels. What one considers, both understand. What one realizes, both know. It's not about being smarter," Aang giggled. "It's about being more." The next several hands proved their point with devastating efficiency. Morrison found himself second-guessing every decision, aware that his opponents were analyzing not just his cards and his betting patterns, but his facial expressions, his breathing, the way he held his shoulders when confident versus when uncertain. Every tell he had developed over decades of professional gambling was being cataloged and cross-referenced by a consciousness that literally never had to look away from him. Worse yet, the twins seemed to be learning and adapting. Their giggling had evolved into a complex language of subtle variations that conveyed information far more efficiently than any verbal communication. A slightly higher pitch might indicate a strong hand at a particular position. A longer duration could signal a bluff. Rhythm changes might coordinate complex strategies that unfolded over multiple hands. "This ain't right," muttered Lucky. Luke Martinez, the fourth regular player, 2 against 1 ain't fair odds. 2 against 1? Tilted his head with apparent. Mr. Martinez, we are one player with 2 bodies, no different from a man with 2 hands playing cards. Though, admittedly, Chang added, with a particularly musical giggle, 2 hands that can observe from different angles. As the evening progressed, word began to spread throughout the saloon. Patrons gathered around the poker table in increasing numbers, drawn by the unprecedented spectacle of professional gamblers being systematically outplayed by what appeared to be a single opponent with an unfair advantage. The twins continued their steady accumulation of winnings, but more importantly, they were demonstrating capabilities that challenged the very foundations of how poker could be played. Deadeye Sullivan was the first to crack. After losing a particularly large pot when the twins somehow knew he was bluffing with nothing but a pair of 4s, he stood abruptly and backed away from the table. "I'm done," he announced. "I've seen marked cards, loaded dice, mirrors, and every other cheat in the book. But this ain't cheating. This is something else entirely, something that makes honest gambling impossible." The twins watched him gather his remaining chips with expressions of polite interest. "Mr. Sullivan," Chang called out, "we do hope we haven't offended you. It's simply that we've found poker to be such an interesting game, especially when played properly." Sullivan paused at the saloon doors, his weathered face grim. "Boys, you ain't just good at poker. You've made poker into something different. Something that ain't got room for the rest of us." His departure sent ripples of unease through the remaining players. If Deadeye Danny Sullivan, a man who had been playing professional poker for over 20 years, couldn't compete against these twins, what hope did anyone else have? Lucky Luke Martinez lasted 3 more hands before he too stood up, shaking his head in defeat. "I came to Copper Creek because I heard it had the best poker players in 3 territories," he said, collecting his significantly reduced. "Guess I should have asked if it had the most human ones." The twins' synchronized laughter followed him out into the night. "Travel safely, Mr. Martinez," Chang called, "and perhaps consider taking up checkers. It's much more conventional." Morrison and Patterson exchanged glances across the table, both men calculating their rapidly diminishing options. The pile of silver in front of the twins had grown to impressive proportions, but more concerning was the demonstration of capabilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitation. Every professional gambler relied on maintaining some form of advantage, better observation skills, superior memory, more accurate probability calculation. But what happened when your opponents possessed abilities that weren't just superior, but fundamentally different? "I'll give you this," Morrison said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "You boys have found yourselves quite the system. But every system has weaknesses. Every advantage can be countered." The twins' giggles took on an almost sympathetic quality. "Oh, Mr. Morrison," Chang said, "you're still thinking like a normal, still assuming we play by rules designed for individual minds," Eng added. "But consciousness itself can be flexible forward despite himself." The twins exchanged one of their loaded glances, and for a moment the saloon fell except for the crackling of the fireplace and the distant sound of horses moving in the street outside. "Tell me, gentlemen," Chang said finally, "what happens when you try to bluff someone who experiences your thoughts as clearly as their own?" Before anyone could respond, Eng continued seamlessly, "What strategies work against an opponent who processes emotional states, multiple perspectives, simultaneously?" "What?" Chang paused, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight with an almost hypnotic intensity. "What do you do when you realize you're not playing against another player, but against a conscious encompass more than one individual mind?" The question hung in the air like smoke snuffed candle. Around the table, the remaining players felt a collective chill as the full implications of what they were facing began to sink in. This wasn't about marked loaded dice, any of the conventional forms of cheating they had encountered throughout their careers. This was about facing an opponent whose very nature challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which poker, and indeed all forms of competitive human interaction, was based. "That's impossible." But his voice lacked conviction. The twins' laughter was gentle, almost kind. "Mr. Patterson," Chang said, 2 hours ago you would have said our very existence was impossible. Yet here we are," Eng giggled, "having the most delightful conversation." Morrison tried one more gambit, raising the stakes significantly on what he knew was a strong hand. A full house, kings over tens. Surely even these unusual opponents couldn't overcome the mathematics of genuinely superior cards. But as the betting progressed, he watched the twins' synchronized reactions with growing horror. Their giggles came in complex patterns that seemed to convey not just information about their own hands, but somehow about his as well. When they called his raise and revealed a straight flush, Morrison finally understood that he wasn't just being outplayed. He was being outthought by a form of intelligence that operated according to principles he couldn't even comprehend, much less counter. I fold, not referring to the current hand, but to the entire evening. I fold every slick. Willie Patterson looked around the table at the empty chairs where his colleagues had sitting just hours earlier, then at the twins who continued their soft, musical giggling as they organized their winning. The mathematical reality was inescapable. They hadn't just won tonight's games. They had demonstrated capabilities that made competitive poker, at least as it had always been understood, effectively obsolete. "You know what you've done, don't you?" His voice heavy with resignation. The twins looked at him with expressions of polite inquiry. "We've played some poker," Chang said simply, "and had such a lovely time doing it." "No, Patterson, you've ended poker for folks like us. Word's going to spread about what every professional player in 3 territories is going to hear about the Nakamura twins who can't be beat, can't be read, can't be understood. Who's going to sit down at a table knowing they're facing that?" For the first time that evening, the twins' laughter paused. They exchanged one of their meaningful, and something passed between them that seemed deeper than mere communication. "That's," Chang began, "that's actually rather sad," Ing finished, and for a moment their usual cheerfulness seemed tinged with genuine regret. "We came to Copper Creek because we heard it had the finest poker players," Chang explained. "We were hoping for worthy opponents, for games that would challenge us. But if our nature makes such games impossible," Eng's voice trailed off, and his expression grew thoughtful. "Then perhaps we've been asking the wrong question," Chang concluded. Patterson gathered his remaining chips, a fraction of what he had started with, and stood up from the table. "Boys, I don't know what you are exactly, but I know what you ain't. You ain't just people who are really good at poker. You're something that makes poker itself different, and that scares me more than losing money ever could." As Patterson headed for the door, Morrison rose as well. The legendary Blackjack Morrison, who had never walked away from a card game in his adult life, looked back at the twins with an expression that mixed respect, fear, and something approaching awe. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "you boys are the most remarkable opponents I've ever faced, and the most terrifying. Not because you're dangerous, but because you make the rest of obsolete." The twins watched the last professional gamblers leave the Silver Dollar Saloon, their synchronized breathing the only sound in the suddenly quiet room. Around them, the regular patrons, cowboys, merchants, drifters, maintained a respectful distance, as if they understood they had witnessed something that transcended mere gambling. "Well," Chang said finally, his voice carrying a note of melancholy that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. "That didn't go quite as we had hoped," Eng finished, their characteristic giggling notably absent. Pete, the bartender, who had been observing the entire evening from behind his counter, finally approached the table. "Begging your pardon, boys, but I got to ask, what exactly are you planning to do now?" The twins looked up at him with identical expressions of uncertainty. "We're not entirely sure," Chang admitted. "We came to Copper Creek seeking worthy opponent. Instead, we seem to have discovered that our very nature makes worthy opposition impossible." Eng sadly. "At least in poker," Pete observed. "But seems to me you boys got talents that might be useful in other ways. Law enforcement, for instance. Be mighty hard for criminals to hide things from folks who can see everything from 2 angles at once." The twins' eyes lit up simultaneously, and for the first time in an hour, their musical laughter returned. "Law enforcement," Chang repeated thoughtfully. "Now there's an interesting possibility," Eng giggled. "Criminals are so much more challenging than card players. More creative in their deceptions," Chang agreed. "More desperate in their strategy," Eng added. As if summoned by their renewed enthusiasm, Sheriff Tom Bradley pushed through the saloon doors, drawn by reports of the evening's unusual events. A tall, weathered man with silver hair and keen gray eyes, Bradley had been keeping the peace in Copper Creek for 8 years and prided himself on understanding the people in his territory. "Evening, boys," he said, approaching the twins' table with careful neutrality. "Here you've been having quite the successful evening." The twins looked up with renewed interest. "Sheriff Bradley, we've heard excellent things about your work here in Copper Creek. The way you handled that cattle rustling problem last month was particularly impressive," Eng added, their giggles returning in full force. Bradley's eyebrows rose. "How did you hear about it?" "Thought we kept the details pretty quiet." "Oh, Sheriff, when you travel as much as we do, you hear all sorts of interesting stories. People love to talk about good law enforcement," Eng giggled, "especially when it's as creative as yours was." Over the next hour, as the saloon gradually emptied and word spread throughout Copper Creek about the evening's events, the twins found themselves in deep conversation with Sheriff Bradley. They discussed the unique challenges of frontier law enforcement, the difficulties of gathering evidence in a territory where witnesses scarce and communication. "Biggest problem I face," explained, "is that criminals got too many advantages out here. Vast distances to escape into, limited ways to verify stories, and plenty of folks who'd rather mind their own business than help with investigation." The twins exchanged one of their meaningful looks. "Sheriff," Chang said slowly, "what if you had access to investigators who could observe criminal behavior from multiple perspectives simultaneously? Who could detect deception through techniques that criminals couldn't anticipate or counter?" Eng added, with growing excitement. "Who could coordinate complex investigation with perfect communication and shared consciousness?" Continued. Bradley leaned back in his chair, studying the two brothers with new appreciation. "Boys, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" The twins' synchronized laughter filled the nearly empty saloon. "Sheriff Bradley," Chang said formally, "we would like to offer our services to Copper Creek's law enforcement effort." "On a temporary basis, of course," Eng giggled, "just until we determine whether criminal investigation provides the intellectual challenges we've been seeking." And so it was that dawn found Copper Creek in a state of unprecedented transformation. The professional gamblers who had terrorized honest citizens for months were already miles away, carrying word throughout the territory of the Nakamura twins' impossible abilities. But more importantly, Sheriff Bradley found himself with two new deputies whose unique nature promised to revolutionize law enforcement in ways no one could have anticipated. Chang and Eng Nakamura had come to Copper Creek seeking worthy opponents in games. Instead, they had discovered something far more valuable, a purpose that utilized their extraordinary abilities in service of justice rather than personal gain. Their musical laughter, which had seemed so unsettling in the context of poker, now carried notes of genuine satisfaction as they contemplated the challenges. The Silver Dollar Saloon, which had been the center of so much corruption, dishonest gambling, gradually transformed into something resembling a normal establishment, where honest folks could enjoy a drink and perhaps a friendly game of cards without fear of professional predators. Pete, the bartender, later claimed it was the first time in years he had seen actual cowboys and merchants relaxing at his poker tables, instead of calculating how quickly they could lose their money to Blackjack Morrison and his crew. But the twins' impact extended far beyond a single saloon or even a single town. Word of their abilities spread throughout the territory like wildfire, carried by the very gamblers who had fled from every crooked poker game, every rigged dice match, every establishment that relied on separating honest folks from their hard-earned money suddenly faced an uncertain future. The mere possibility that the Nakamura twins might arrive was enough to make professional cheaters reconsider their career choices. More significantly, their partnership with Sheriff Bradley began to yield immediate results. Their first case involved a series of cattle thefts that had puzzled local ranchers for weeks. Traditional investigation methods had failed because the thieves were clever enough to leave no obvious evidence and careful enough to vary their. But the twins' ability to observe potential crime scenes from multiple angles simultaneously, combined with their shared consciousness, process and correlate vast amounts of information, allowed them to identify subtle clues that had been invisible to conventional investigators. Chong noticed the way certain hoofprints were slightly deeper on one side, suggesting horses carrying extra weight. Simultaneously, Eng observed the patterns of disturbed vegetation that indicated the thieves. Their shared consciousness immediately correlated these observations with reports from different ranchers, revealing a pattern that pointed directly to the criminals' hideout. The cattle thieves were apprehended within 48 hours, along with nearly 50 head of stolen livestock. More importantly, the twins' methods proved so effective that they began receiving requests for assistance from law enforcement officers in neighboring counties. As the weeks passed, Chang and Eng Nakamura's reputation evolved from that of mysterious gamblers to legendary investigators. Their musical laughter, once associated with the downfall of crooked poker players, became a sound that honest citizens welcomed and criminals feared. They had found their calling not in games of chance, but in the infinitely more complex and rewarding pursuit of justice. The Silver Dollar Saloon still hosted poker games, but they were now friendly contests between equals rather than systematic exploitation of the unwary. Sheriff Bradley's territory became known as one of the most peaceful and law-abiding regions in 3 states, protected by investigators whose unique abilities made traditional criminal methods obsolete. And sometimes, late in the evening, when their official duties were complete, Chang and Eng would sit at their old table in the Silver Dollar and play quiet games of chess or checkers with local citizens. Their laughter would fill the room with the same musical quality that had once terrorized professional gamblers, but now it carried notes of contentment and purpose that made everyone who heard it feel somehow more secure. The professional card sharps who had fled Copper Creek that dawn never returned. Word spread throughout the gambling community that the Nakamura twins had found a new calling, one that suited their extraordinary abilities far better than merely winning money from increasingly desperate opponents. Some of the former gamblers found honest work. Others moved to distant territories where their reputation hadn't preceded them. But none ever forgot the night when 2 giggling Siamese twins had walked into the Silver Dollar Saloon and changed everything. In the end, Chang and Eng Nakamura had achieved something far more valuable than victory at the poker table. They had found a way to use their unique gifts in service of their community, transforming from mysterious strangers into beloved protectors. Their story became the stuff of legend throughout the territory, not as the twins who could never lose at cards, but as the investigators who could see truth from angles no one else could imagine. And every time someone told that story, they would mention how it all began with 2 giggling brothers entering a saloon, their musical laughter promising changes no one could have anticipated. By dawn, every card shark had indeed the county's money, but because they had encountered something that made their entire way of life impossible to continue. The twins had won far more than a poker game that. They had won a new life, a new purpose, respect of an entire community. Their laughter still echoed through the Silver Dollar Saloon, but now it carried the sound of justice being served and a job well done.